standing on the rocky shore admiring the sunset. A splash in the distance followed by another closer, curious, leaning forward to peer into the gathering dusk. Massive jaws erupted from the water, impossibly fast, yanked off the rocks, plunging into the freezing sea. The last sensation, crushing pressure and razor-sharp teeth. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the ORCA ATTACK story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. The salty breeze whipped through Jack Thornton's graying hair as he stood on the dock, his weathered hands gripping a checklist. At 45, the lines etched into his face told stories of countless voyages, but none quite like the one he was about to embark upon. His 30-foot sailboat, aptly named Serenity, bobbed gently in the harbor of Port Hardy, British Columbia, a stark contrast to the turmoil of anticipation churning in Jack's gut. "All right, old girl," Jack muttered, patting the hull of his beloved vessel. "Just you and me for the next few weeks. Let's hope we're both up for it." He methodically went through his pre-departure routine, double-checking every item on his list. Food stores, check. Water purification system, check. Emergency flares, check. As he ticked off each item, the weight of solitude began to settle on his shoulders. This journey through the Inside Passage was to be his most ambitious solo sail, yet a test of skill and self-reliance in one of the most beautiful and treacherous waterways in the world. Jack's reverie was interrupted by a booming voice from the dock. "Heading out alone again, Thornton? You got a death wish or something?" He turned to see the harbor master, Bill, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, watching him with a mix of admiration and concern. Jack managed a wry smile. "You know me, Bill. Can't resist the call of the sea." Bill shook his head, chuckling. "Well, you be careful out there. Weather report says it should be smooth sailing, but you know how quickly things can turn in these waters." "Don't I know it?" Jack replied, his mind flashing to close calls from past voyages. "I'll keep my wits about me." As Jack continued his preparations, he couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would be different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension he couldn't quite place. He chalked it up to pre-voyage jitters and focused on the task at hand. The sun was climbing higher in the sky when Jack finally untied the mooring lines. With practiced ease, he maneuvered Serenity out of the harbor, the gentle purr of the auxiliary motor soon giving way to the satisfying flap of wind-filled sails. As Port Hardy receded into the distance, Jack allowed himself a moment of pure joy. This was why he sailed. The freedom, the challenge, the untamed beauty of the open water. The coastline stretched out before him, a rugged tapestry of evergreens and rocky cliffs. It was then that he saw them. A pod of orcas, their distinctive black and white bodies breaching the surface in a breathtaking display of power and grace. Jack had seen orcas before, but never this close to the beginning of a journey. He couldn't help but feel it was a good omen. "Well, would you look at that?" he breathed, reaching for his binoculars. Through the lenses, he could make out at least 5 individuals, their dorsal fins slicing through the water with effortless precision. For a moment, one of the larger orcas seemed to lock eyes with him, and Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. There was an intelligence there, an awareness that both thrilled and unsettled him. As the pod moved on, disappearing into the vastness of the Johnstone Strait, Jack shook off the lingering unease. He had a long journey ahead, and he needed to stay focused. The day progressed without incident, Serenity cutting through the water with a steady rhythm. Jack fell into the familiar routine of solo sailing, adjusting the sails, checking his bearings, keeping a watchful eye on the ever-changing conditions around him. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, and Jack found himself grateful for the wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. As afternoon faded into evening, Jack consulted his charts looking for a suitable spot to anchor for the night. He'd made good progress, covering more nautical miles than he'd anticipated. A small, sheltered cove caught his eye, the perfect spot to rest and recharge for the challenges that lay ahead. With the sun dipping towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Jack carefully navigated Serenity into the cove. The water was calm here, protected from the stronger currents of the main passage. As he dropped anchor, the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant cry of seabirds settling in for the night. Jack prepared a simple meal of canned chili and crackers, eating in the cockpit as he watched the last light fade from the sky. The stars emerged, impossibly bright away from the light pollution of civilization. He allowed himself a small measure of whiskey, savoring the burn as he contemplated the journey ahead. "Not a bad start, eh, Serenity?" Jack said aloud, patting the ship's wheel affectionately. Talking to his boat was an old habit, one that helped stave off the loneliness that sometimes crept in during these solo voyages. As he was about to head below deck to turn in for the night, a movement in the water caught Jack's eye. He peered into the darkness, straining to see what had disturbed the calm surface. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed a large, dark shape, gliding just beneath the waves, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Jack frowned, an inexplicable sense of unease settling over him. "Probably just a seal," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But as he made his way to his bunk, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching. Sleep came fitfully that night. Jack's dreams were plagued by visions of vast, dark shapes moving beneath his boat, of intelligent eyes, watching him from the depths. He tossed and turned, the gentle rocking of Serenity providing little comfort. In the darkest hour of the night, Jack was startled awake by a sound, a long, haunting call that seemed to reverberate through the hull of the boat. He lay perfectly still, heart pounding, straining his ears. The sound came again, closer this time, unmistakably the vocalization of an orca. Jack scrambled out of his bunk, making his way to the deck on unsteady legs. The night was pitch black, the stars obscured by a thin layer of clouds that had rolled in. He fumbled for his flashlight, flicking it on and shining it across the water. The beam caught something in its light, a tall black dorsal fin breaking the surface just yards from Serenity. As Jack watched, frozen in place, more fins appeared, circling the boat with deliberate, synchronized movements. "What the hell?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of blood rushing in his ears. This wasn't normal orca behavior, not by a long shot. In all his years of sailing, he'd never seen anything like it. As suddenly as they had appeared, the fins sank beneath the surface, leaving the cove as calm and silent as before. Jack remained on deck for hours, flashlight in hand, watching for any sign of the orca's return. But there was nothing, only the gentle lapping of waves and the distant cry of a loon. When the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Jack was still awake, his mind racing with possibilities. Had he imagined it all? Was it just a vivid nightmare brought on by the whiskey and the solitude? As he prepared to raise anchor and continue his journey, Jack tried to shake off the lingering fear from the night before. He was an experienced sailor after all. He'd faced storms and mechanical failures and come out the other side. Whatever lay ahead, he told himself, he was ready for it. But as Serenity glided out of the cove and back into the main channel of the inside passage, Jack couldn't help but scan the water nervously. The beauty of the landscape that had so captivated him yesterday now seemed ominous, full of hidden dangers. Little did Jack know, as he set his course for the day ahead, that the true test of his skill and courage was just beginning. The calm waters of the inside passage held secrets beneath their surface, and the line between predator and prey was about to be blurred in ways he could never have imagined. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Jack Thornton stood at the helm of Serenity, his eyes bloodshot from a night of fitful sleep. The events of the previous evening, the circling fins, the haunting calls, had left him on edge, questioning his own senses. As he raised the anchor, the usual sounds of a marine awakening were noticeably absent. No gulls cried overhead, no seals barked in the distance. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. Just paranoia, Jack muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. Get it together, Thornton. He busied himself with the familiar routine of setting sail, hoping the normalcy would calm his frayed nerves. As Serenity glided out of the sheltered cove and into the open waters of the inside passage, Jack forced himself to admire the breathtaking scenery. Mist clung to the densely forested shoreline, and snow-capped peaks loomed in the distance. It was the kind of view that had drawn him to solo sailing in the first place, the raw, untamed beauty of nature. But as the morning wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The water was too calm, the air too still. He found himself constantly scanning the horizon, searching for what? He wasn't sure. It was nearly midday when he saw them. Dorsal fins, sleek and black, cutting through the water with purposeful grace. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. Orcas. At least 5 of them, maybe more. Okay, stay calm, he said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the quiet. They're probably just passing through. But as he watched, the pod changed course, heading directly for Serenity. Their movements were synchronized, deliberate. This wasn't a chance encounter. Jack's mind raced. In all his years of sailing, he'd never heard of orcas actively approaching a boat like this. They were known to be curious, yes, but this felt different. As the orcas drew closer, Jack could make out their distinctive black and white markings. They were magnificent creatures, power and intelligence evident in every movement. Under different circumstances, he would have been thrilled at such a close encounter. The lead orca, a massive bull with a towering dorsal fin, surfaced mere yards from the boat. For a moment, its eye met Jack's, and he felt a chill run down his spine. There was an awareness there, an intent that seemed almost human. Easy there, big fella, Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. Just passing through, no need for... His words were cut short as the orca suddenly dove, disappearing beneath the surface. For a heartbeat, all was quiet. Then, without warning, Serenity shuddered violently as something struck the stern. Jack was thrown off his feet, crashing hard onto the deck. He scrambled up, heart pounding, to see the bull orca surfacing behind the boat. Had it rammed them? What the hell? Jack gasped, gripping the railing to steady himself. Before he could fully process what had happened, another orca appeared on the port side, swimming alongside Serenity. With unnerving precision, Jack watched, paralyzed, as the creature seemed to eye the hull of his beloved boat. Suddenly, the orca veered sharply, its massive body slamming into Serenity with bone-jarring force. The impact sent Jack sprawling once again, and he heard the ominous sound of splintering wood. Panic seized him. This wasn't curiosity or playfulness. This was an attack. Jack lunged for the radio, his hands shaking as he tried to tune to the emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday. This is the sailboat Serenity, approximately 20 nautical miles southeast of Port McNeil. I'm under attack by a pod of orcas, requesting immediate assistance. Static was his only reply. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized the radio must have been damaged in the assault. He was alone, cut off from any hope of rescue. The orcas continued to circle, their dorsal fins slicing through the water like knives. Jack's mind raced, trying to recall everything he knew about orca behavior. They were intelligent, social creatures known for complex hunting strategies. But attacking a boat? It was unheard of. Think, damn it, Jack berated himself. He needed a plan, needed to find a way to deter them before they did serious damage to the boat. Or to him. He rushed below deck, searching frantically for anything that might help. His eyes fell on the emergency flare gun. It was a long shot, but maybe the noise and light would startle the orcas enough to drive them off. As Jack emerged back on deck, flare gun in hand, he was met with a sight that turned his blood to ice. The bull orca had positioned itself directly in front of Serenity, its massive body perpendicular to the boat's path. Even from a distance, Jack could see the intent in its eyes. It was preparing to charge. Time seemed to slow. Jack raised the flare gun with trembling hands, aiming at the space just above the orca's head. He squeezed the trigger, and the flare shot out with a deafening bang, arcing over the water in a trail of bright red sparks. For a moment, the orcas hesitated, their synchronized movements faltering. Jack allowed himself a glimmer of hope. But then, as the flare sizzled out in the water, the bull orca let out a haunting call. The sound sent chills down Jack's spine. It was angry, challenging. With a powerful thrust of its tail, the orca surged forward. Jack could only watch in horror as the massive creature bore down on Serenity. The impact, when it came, was catastrophic. The bull's body struck the boat's bow with the force of a battering ram. Jack was thrown backwards, his head slamming against the mast with a sickening crack. Stars exploded in his vision as he crumpled to the deck. Through the haze of pain, Jack was dimly aware of the sounds of splintering wood and rushing water. Serenity listed heavily to one side, and he could feel the deck tilting beneath him. The orca's calls seemed to blend with the ringing in his ears, creating a nightmarish cacophony. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Jack dragged himself to the stern. The sight that met him there nearly stopped his heart. The rudder hung uselessly, half torn from its mountings. Without it, Serenity was at the mercy of the currents and the orcas. As if sensing their advantage, the pod renewed their assault with terrifying vigor. They took turns ramming the boat, their powerful bodies slamming into the hull with precision strikes. Each impact sent shudders through the vessel, and Jack could hear the ominous creaking of stressed wood. In that moment, as he clung to the railings of his beloved Serenity, Jack Thornton faced the chilling realization that he might not survive this encounter. The orcas, creatures he had always admired from a distance, had become an unstoppable force of nature, intent on his destruction. With his radio dead and his boat rapidly taking on water, Jack knew he had to act fast, but as he looked out at the pod of orcas circling like sharks, their dorsal fins cutting through the water with deadly purpose, he was struck by a terrifying thought. What if this was just the beginning? The inside passage stretched out before him, miles of treacherous water between him and the nearest safe harbor. And somewhere in those waters, a pod of orcas waited, their intentions as mysterious as they were deadly. As Serenity drifted helplessly, Jack Thornton steeled himself for the fight of his life. The calm of the morning had given way to a nightmare, and the true test of his skills and his will to survive was only just beginning. Jack Thornton's world had narrowed to a single desperate focus: survival. The peaceful solo voyage he'd envisioned had transformed into a waking nightmare, with Serenity now little more than a wounded animal at the mercy of a relentless predator. The orcas continued to circle, their massive black and white bodies gliding through the water with an eerie grace that belied their destructive intent. Jack's eyes darted frantically between the circling fins and the rapidly worsening condition of his boat. "Come on, think," he growled through gritted teeth, his mind racing. Years of sailing experience hadn't prepared him for this. Orcas weren't supposed to attack boats, let alone with such coordinated precision. Another powerful ram to Serenity's hull sent Jack stumbling. He caught himself on the mast, wincing as his bruised body protested the movement. The boat groaned ominously, timbers creaking under the assault. Jack knew he needed to act fast. With the rudder damaged, steering was near impossible, but maybe he could use the sails to gain some control. He moved to adjust the mainsail, hoping to catch enough wind to at least move them toward shallower waters where the orcas might be less inclined to follow. As he worked, he kept a wary eye on the pod. The bull orca, easily identifiable by its towering dorsal fin, seemed to be directing the others. It hung back, almost observing, while two smaller orcas took turns battering the boat. Suddenly, one of the orcas breached spectacularly close to the starboard side. For a heart-stopping moment, Jack thought it would land directly on the deck. He stumbled backwards, losing his footing on the wet surface and crashing hard onto his back. "Jesus Christ," he gasped, the wind knocked out of him. The orca crashed back into the water mere feet from the boat, sending a spray of icy seawater over Jack. As he blinked the salt from his eyes, he could have sworn he saw the creature's eye fixed on him, intelligent and calculating. The moment passed, and Jack scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He needed to check for damage below deck. If the hull had been breached, his chances of survival would plummet from slim to none. Keeping low and bracing himself against the boat's erratic movement, Jack made his way to the cabin entrance. Each step was treacherous, the deck slick with seawater and listing badly to one side. As he descended into the cabin, the sounds of the orca's assault became muffled, replaced by the alarming gurgle of water. Jack's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a sight that made his stomach drop. A thin but steady stream of water was seeping in through a hairline crack in the hull. No, Jack muttered, his mind racing. He had emergency patches, but applying them would mean going into the water. With the orcas still circling, That was tantamount to suicide. A thunderous impact rocked the boat, nearly knocking Jack off his feet again. He steadied himself against the wall, his palm coming away sticky. In the beam of his flashlight, he saw a smear of red, blood. His own, from a cut he hadn't even noticed in the chaos. The sight of blood snapped Jack back to a chilling reality. He wasn't just fighting against a sinking boat. He was prey being hunted by one of nature's most intelligent predators, and he was wounded. Forcing down his rising panic, Jack grabbed a hand pump and began to bail. It was a losing battle, he knew, but every minute he could keep Serenity afloat was another minute to figure out a plan. As he worked, his arms burning with the effort, Jack's mind whirled. Why were the orcas attacking? It didn't make sense. They weren't known to mistake boats for prey, and this assault seemed too coordinated, too purposeful to be simple curiosity. Another bone-jarring impact sent Jack sprawling. Water sloshed around his feet, significantly deeper than it had been. Moments ago, he knew he couldn't stay below deck any longer. If the boat went down suddenly, he'd be trapped. Clutching the pump, Jack made his way back to the deck. The scene that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. The orcas had redoubled their efforts, their sleek bodies torpedoing through the water with frightening speed before slamming into Serenity's hull. Jack watched in horror as one orca managed to get its powerful jaws around what remained of the rudder. With a twist of its massive body, it tore the rudder clean off. The screech of twisting metal cut through the air, and Serenity lurched violently. "No!" Jack yelled, his voice hoarse. Without the rudder, the boat was completely at the mercy of the currents and the orcas. In that moment of despair, Jack's eyes landed on the emergency radio beacon. In the chaos, he'd completely forgotten about it. It was a long shot. Help would take hours to arrive if it came at all. But it was all he had left. With shaking hands, Jack activated the beacon. A small red light blinked to life, and he offered a silent prayer to whatever god might be listening that the signal would reach someone, anyone. But Jack knew he couldn't rely on rescue alone. He needed to buy time, to find a way to deter the orcas long enough to get to safety. His eyes scanned the deck desperately, looking for anything that might help. They landed on the boat hook, a long pole usually used for pushing off from docks. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to a weapon he had. Gripping the boat hook tightly, Jack moved to the side of the boat where the orcas were concentrating their attack. He could see them coming, their dorsal fins cutting through the water as they lined up another assault. "Come on, you bastards," Jack growled, his knuckles white around the boat hook. As the lead orca approached, he braced himself. The impact, when it came, nearly threw Jack overboard. But he held his ground, and as the orca's slick body slid, along the hull he struck. The boat hook connected solidly with the orca's sensitive snout, eliciting a high-pitched squeal that cut through the air. For a moment, everything stopped. The orca recoiled, its tail thrashing as it retreated. The other members of the pod paused in their assault, their dorsal fins circling warily. Jack allowed himself a moment of hope. Had he found a way to deter them? But then the bull orca, the massive leader of the pod, let out a haunting call. It was a sound filled with rage and challenge, and it chilled Jack to his very core. As if answering a battle cry, the pod reformed. Their movements became even more coordinated, more purposeful. Jack realized with a sinking feeling that he had only succeeded in making them angrier. The orcas resumed their attack with renewed vigor. They came at the boat from all sides now, their powerful bodies slamming into Serenity with a force that threatened to tear her apart. Jack stumbled to the bow, his eyes scanning the horizon desperately. In the distance, he could make out the silhouette of land, an island, or maybe the mainland. It was too far to swim, especially with the orcas in pursuit. But if he could, just keep Serenity afloat long enough to reach shallower waters. A deafening crack cut through the air, and Jack whirled around in time to see the mast splinter. It swayed dangerously, ropes snapping under the strain. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, watching helplessly as his last means of steering began to fail. In that moment, as Serenity groaned and listed beneath him, Jack Thornton faced the very real possibility that he might not survive this encounter. The orcas, creatures he had once admired for their intelligence and grace, had become an implacable force of nature intent on his destruction. But as he gripped the railings of his sinking boat, watching the relentless assault of the orca pod, a steely determination took hold. He wasn't dead yet, and as long as he had breath in his body, he would fight. With renewed purpose, Jack turned his attention to the island in the distance. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. Somehow, he had to find a way to guide his crippled boat to those shores, to outlast the orca's assault. As another wave crashed over the deck, soaking him to the bone, Jack Thornton set his jaw. The real battle, he realized, was only just beginning. The relentless assault of the orcas had transformed the once peaceful waters of the Inside Passage into a battlefield. Jack Thornton, his body battered and his spirit teetering on the edge of breaking, clung to the helm of Serenity with grim determination. The boat, once his pride and joy, now groaned and shuddered beneath him like a dying animal. "Come on, old girl," Jack muttered, his voice hoarse. Just a little longer. His eyes darted between the circling dorsal fins and the distant shoreline. The island he'd spotted earlier was his only hope now, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. With the rudder torn away and the mast threatening to topple at any moment, guiding Serenity was an exercise in futility. A massive black and white form suddenly breached the surface mere yards from the bow. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he locked eyes with the bull orca. There was an intelligence in that gaze that sent chills down his spine. Not just the cold calculation of a predator, but something deeper, almost vengeful. "What do you want from me?" Jack shouted, his frustration and fear boiling over. The orca simply slipped back beneath the waves, leaving Jack feeling foolish and even more unsettled. He knew he needed to do something, anything, to change the tide of this brutal encounter. His mind raced, recalling every scrap of knowledge he had about orca behavior, every piece of emergency equipment on board. There had to be something he could use. Keeping one hand on the useless wheel, Jack began to search the deck frantically. His fingers brushed against something in a storage compartment, and he felt a glimmer of hope. The flare gun. He'd used one earlier to no effect, but maybe if he could time it right. Jack's planning was interrupted by another bone-jarring impact. One of the smaller orcas had rammed Serenity from below, lifting the entire stern out of the water for a terrifying moment. Jack was thrown to the deck, his head cracking against the gunwale. Stars exploded in his vision, and for a moment, the world swam in and out of focus. As he blinked away, the darkness threatening to engulf him, Jack became aware of a new sound, the unmistakable gurgle of water rushing into the boat. "No, no, no," he gasped, scrambling to his feet. The latest attack had opened up a significant breach in the hull. Serenity was taking on water fast. Jack knew he had minutes, maybe less, before the boat would become completely unseaworthy. He had to act now. With shaking hands, he grabbed the flare gun and loaded it. The orcas were regrouping, their dorsal fins slicing through the water as they prepared for another assault. Jack waited, his breath coming in ragged gasps, for the right moment. The bull orca surged forward, its massive body torpedoing through the water straight for Serenity's vulnerable stern. Jack took aim, saying a silent prayer to whatever god might be listening. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered. Just a little. Closer. At the last possible second, when he could see the white patches around the orca's eyes, Jack fired. The flare shot out with a deafening bang, its bright red trail arcing just over the orca's head. The effect was instantaneous. The bull orca veered off sharply, its powerful body twisting to avoid the sudden burst of light and sound. The rest of the pod scattered, their synchronized movements faltering for the first time since the attack began. Jack allowed himself a moment of savage triumph. "That's right," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Get back, you sons of bitches." But his victory was short-lived. As the red glow of the flare faded, Jack could see the orcas regrouping. The bull orca let out a haunting call that seemed to reverberate through the very hull of the boat. It was a sound filled with rage and challenge. Jack's momentary elation evaporated as he realized he had only succeeded in making them angrier. The orcas resumed their attack with renewed vigor, their movements even more coordinated and purposeful than before. Serenity groaned beneath him, listing heavily to one side. Water sloshed around Jack's feet, rising with alarming speed. He knew the boat wouldn't stay afloat much longer. With a sickening clarity, Jack realized he was out of options. There was only one choice left, and it was one that filled him with paralyzing dread. He would have to abandon ship. The thought of entering the water, of making himself even more vulnerable to the orca's attack, made Jack's blood run cold. But staying on Serenity was a death sentence. At least in the water, he'd have a chance, however slim, of making it to shore. Moving with frantic energy, Jack began to prepare. He grabbed the life jacket he'd foolishly neglected to wear earlier, strapping it on with trembling fingers. He found the emergency ditch bag, stuffed with survival essentials, and slung it over his shoulder. As he worked, the orcas continued their relentless assault. Each impact sent shudders through the boat, and Jack could hear the ominous creaking of overstressed wood and metal. Just as he was about to make the leap, Jack's eyes fell on the boat hook he'd used earlier. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed it, gripping the familiar weight like a lifeline. Taking a deep breath, Jack moved to the side of the boat farthest from where the orcas were concentrating their attack. The shoreline seemed impossibly far away, a thin line of green on the horizon. "You can do this," Jack told himself, trying to summon every ounce of courage he had left. "Just swim. Don't think about what's in the water. Just swim." With one last look at his beloved Serenity, now more wreck than boat, Jack Thornton stepped off the deck and into the frigid waters of the inside passage. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. For a terrifying moment, Jack thought he might black out from the shock. But survival instinct kicked in and he began to swim, his strokes clumsy and panicked at first, then settling into a steadier rhythm. Behind him, he could hear the death throes of Serenity as she finally succumbed to the orca's attack. The sound of splintering wood and rushing water filled the air, mingling with the haunting calls of the orca pod. Jack didn't dare look back. He focused every ounce of his being on the distant shore, on the mechanical action of one stroke after another. The life jacket kept him buoyant, but the weight of the ditch bag and the boat hook dragged at him, making each movement a struggle. For a few blessed moments, there was nothing but the sound of his own labored breathing and the splash of his arms cutting through the water. Jack allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the orcas would be satisfied with the destruction of his boat. That hope was shattered by a chilling sound, the unmistakable exhalation of an orca's blowhole, much too close for comfort. Jack's heart nearly stopped. Slowly, dreading what he might see, he turned in the water. The entire pod was there, spread out in a semicircle behind him. They moved with an almost lazy grace, easily keeping pace with his desperate swimming. The bull orca was in the center, its dorsal fin standing tall like the sail of a warship. As Jack watched, frozen in terror, the bull orca surged forward. It dove beneath the surface, and for a heart-stopping moment Jack lost sight of it. Then, with a surge of displaced water, it burst from the waves mere feet in front of him. Jack reacted on pure instinct. As the orca's massive body arced over him, he swung the boat hook with all his might. The metal tip connected solidly with the orca's sensitive underbelly, eliciting a high-pitched squeal of pain and surprise. The orca crashed back into the water, its massive tail missing Jack's head by inches. The impact sent him tumbling, and for a terrifying moment, he was submerged, unsure of which way was up. When he finally broke the surface, gasping for air, Jack found himself face to face with the bull orca. Those intelligent eyes bored into him, filled with what could only be described as cold fury. In that moment, as he treaded water with aching limbs, the shore still devastatingly far away, Jack Thornton knew with chilling certainty that this was far from over. The orcas weren't done with him. This wasn't just an attack. It was a hunt. And he was the prey. The frigid waters of the inside passage clawed at Jack Thornton's body, each stroke a battle against exhaustion and the creeping numbness in his limbs. Behind him, the haunting calls of the orca pod echoed across the water, a chilling reminder that death lurked just beneath the surface. Jack's mind raced as fast as his heart. The shore seemed no closer than when he'd first abandoned the sinking wreckage of Serenity. Each time he dared to look back, he saw the orca's dorsal fin slicing through the water, maintaining a distance that was too close for comfort, yet just far enough to be out of reach of his makeshift weapon. "They're toying with me," Jack gasped, between labored breaths. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through him. These weren't mindless predators. They were intelligent hunters, and he was caught in a game he didn't understand the rules of. A sudden disturbance in the water to his left made Jack flinch. One of the smaller orcas had broken formation, swimming parallel to him just yards away. Its black and white body glided effortlessly through the water, a stark contrast to Jack's desperate struggle. "What do you want?" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the lapping waves. The orca simply rolled to its side, its eye fixed on him with unnerving intensity. Jack's arms burned with fatigue, and he could feel his strokes becoming weaker, less coordinated. The weight of the ditch bag dragged at him, threatening to pull him under. Part of him knew he should let it go, lighten his load to increase his chances of reaching shore. But the survival gear it contained might be his only hope if, when, he made it to land. A flash of movement in his peripheral vision was all the warning Jack had. The bull orca, the massive leader of the pod, surged forward in a burst of speed. Jack barely had time to take a breath before the orca dove, its sleek body disappearing beneath the waves. Time seemed to slow. Jack treaded water, his head swiveling frantically as he tried to predict where the attack would come from. The other orcas had stopped their advance, forming a loose circle around him. They were waiting, watching. The water beneath Jack exploded upward as the bull orca burst from the depths. Its massive body rocketed into the air, jaws open wide, aimed directly at him. Jack reacted on pure instinct, swinging the boat hook with every ounce of strength he had left. The metal tip connected with a sickening thud against the orca's lower jaw. The creature's momentum carried it forward, and for a terrifying moment Jack was engulfed in a spray of icy water and the overpowering scent of fish and brine. Then he was underwater, tumbling in the orca's wake. Disoriented, lungs burning, Jack flailed wildly. His hand struck something solid, the orca's flank, and he pushed off, desperate to find the surface. Jack burst from the water with a gasping breath, coughing and sputtering. The bull orca was nowhere to be seen, but the rest of the pod had tightened their circle. Their dorsal fins cut through the water like knives, and their haunting calls filled the air. As Jack struggled to regain his bearings, his eyes landed on something that made his heart leap. A fishing trawler, its white hull gleaming in the distance. "Hey!" Jack shouted, waving his arms frantically. "Over here! Help!" But the boat was too far away, its crew oblivious to the life-and-death struggle playing out in the waters nearby. Jack watched with sinking despair as the trawler continued on its course, growing smaller by the second. A sharp pain in his leg snapped Jack's attention back to his immediate surroundings. He looked down to see a thin trail of blood clouding the water around his calf. In the chaos of the orca's attack, he must have caught himself on the jagged edge of the boat hook. Cold dread washed over him. Blood in the water. He was injured, tired, and now leaving a trail for the orcas to follow. As if on cue, the bull orca resurfaced. A thin line of red marred its lower jaw where the boat hook had struck, but its eyes were fixed on Jack with terrifying focus. It let out a low, rumbling call that seemed to vibrate through the water. The pod responded immediately, their circle tightening. Jack spun in the water, realizing with horror that he was completely surrounded. The orcas moved with fluid grace, their black and white bodies sliding beneath the surface only to reappear moments later, always closer. Jack's mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. The shore was still too far, the fishing boat long gone. He was alone, injured, and rapidly running out of strength and options. A crazy idea began to form in Jack's exhausted mind. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, but it was all he had left. Taking a deep breath, Jack dove beneath the surface. The salt water stung his eyes, but he forced them open, searching the murky depths. There, a darker shape against the gloom. The bull orca was circling below, preparing for another attack. Jack kicked hard, driving himself deeper. Every instinct screamed at him to return to the surface, to not willingly put himself in the orca's path. But he pressed on, his lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. The orca saw him coming. It turned, its massive body coiling like a spring. Jack tightened his grip on the boat hook, knowing he would only get one chance at this. Time seemed to slow as predator and prey rushed towards each other. Jack could see every detail of the orca's face, the scars around its mouth, the intelligence in its eyes, the rows of sharp teeth visible behind slightly parted jaws. At the last possible second, Jack twisted in the water. As the orca's open mouth rushed towards him, he jammed the boathook sideways, wedging it between the creature's upper and lower jaws. The impact sent shockwaves through Jack's body. For a moment he was sure his arms would be torn from their sockets, but the makeshift bite block held, and the orca thrashed in confusion and pain. Jack kicked hard, using the orca's momentum to propel himself towards the surface. His vision was starting to darken around the edges, his lungs screaming for air. Just a little further. He broke the surface with a desperate gasp, sucking in great lungfuls of air. The orcas were in chaos, their synchronized movements shattered. The bull thrashed at the surface, trying to dislodge the boathook stuck in its mouth. Jack knew he had bought himself only moments. Already, two of the other orcas were moving towards him, their dorsal fins cutting through the water with deadly purpose. With the last reserves of his strength, Jack began to swim. Each stroke was agony, his muscles pushed far beyond their limits. But a new fire burned in his chest. Hope. He had wounded the Alpha, disrupted the pod's attack. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. The shore still seemed impossibly far away, but Jack forced himself to focus on each individual stroke. One arm in front of the other, legs kicking steadily despite the stabbing pain in his calf. He couldn't afford to think about how far he had to go, or about the deadly predators that were surely regrouping behind him. As he swam, Jack became aware of a new sound cutting through the air, the distinctive whump 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 of helicopter blades. He paused, treading water, and looked up to see a Coast Guard chopper sweeping low over the water. "Here!" Jack shouted, waving his arms frantically. "I'm here!" The helicopter banked sharply, and Jack saw a figure leaning out the side door, scanning the water. Had they seen him? Or were they looking for the wreckage of Serenity, unaware that her captain was fighting for his life in the cold waters below? A haunting call from behind him sent a chill down Jack's spine. The orcas had regrouped. The bull was nowhere to be seen, but the rest of the pod was forming up, preparing for one final assault. Jack looked from the approaching orcas to the helicopter circling overhead. He was caught between salvation and certain death, with only yards of open water in between. Everything would come down to the next few moments. With a deep breath, Jack Thornton began to swim. Each stroke was a defiance against the odds, a refusal to give up in the face of nature's most intelligent and deadly predators. The orcas surged forward, their sleek bodies cutting through the water with terrifying speed. It was going to be close. Too close. As the first dorsal fin broke the water mere feet behind him, Jack Thornton made a silent promise to whatever god might be listening. If he survived this, he would never take the ocean's power for granted again. The race was on, and only time would tell if Jack's desperate bid for survival would be enough to outpace the relentless hunters at his heels. The rhythmic thrum of the Coast Guard helicopter's blades cut through the air, a beacon of hope in Jack Thornton's desperate struggle for survival. But hope, Jack realized with grim clarity, could be a double-edged sword. It gave him strength, pushing his battered body beyond its limits, but it also made the possibility of failure all the more terrifying. Come on, Jack gasped, his arms carving through the frigid water with mechanical precision. Each stroke was agony, his muscles screaming in protest, but he forced himself to maintain the punishing pace. The alternative, slowing down, giving in to the exhaustion, was unthinkable. Behind him, the haunting calls of the orca pod filled the air. Jack didn't dare look back, knowing that the sight of those sleek black dorsal fins cutting through the water would shatter what little resolve he had left. He could feel them, though. Their presence was a physical weight pressing down on him, spurring him forward with the primal fear of prey being hunted. The helicopter swooped lower, its downdraft creating a maelstrom of spray that momentarily blinded Jack. He sputtered, fighting to keep his head above water as the waves churned around him. "Here!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the roar of the rotors. "I'm here!" A voice crackled over a loudspeaker, distorted, but unmistakably human. "We see you, sir. Hold on." Jack's heart soared. They'd seen him. Help was coming, if he could just hold out a little longer. A disturbance in the water to his left made Jack flinch. One of the smaller orcas had broken from the pod, swimming parallel to him just yards away. Its black and white body glided effortlessly through the water. A stark contrast to Jack's desperate struggle. The orca rolled to its side, its eye fixed on Jack with unnerving intelligence. "Back off!" Jack shouted, swinging an arm wildly in the orca's direction. The movement threw him off balance, and he went under for a heart-stopping moment before, fighting his way back to the surface. The helicopter was closer now, hovering just above the waves. Jack could see a rescue swimmer poised in the open door, preparing to jump, but the downdraft from the rotors was creating a dangerous turbulence, pushing Jack further from safety and towards the waiting jaws of the orca pod. "We can't get any closer," the voice on the loudspeaker boomed. "You need to swim to us." Jack wanted to scream in frustration. Didn't they see the orcas? Didn't they understand the danger? But he knew the rescue crew was right. They couldn't risk the helicopter getting too close to the water, not with the unpredictable movements of the orca pod. Gritting his teeth against the pain and exhaustion, Jack began to swim towards the helicopter. Every stroke was a battle, not just against the choppy waves, but against the growing numbness in his limbs. The cold was seeping into his bones, making his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. A sharp pain in his leg made Jack cry out. He looked down to see a fresh cloud of blood blooming in the water around his calf. The wound he'd sustained earlier had reopened, leaving a trail that might as well have been a neon sign to the predators circling behind him. As if on cue, a haunting call echoed across the water. Jack's blood ran cold. He knew that sound. It was the bull orca, the massive leader of the pod, the same one he'd managed to injure with the boat hook. Jack spun in the water, his eyes scanning the waves, frantically. Where was it? The other orcas were still there, their dorsal fins slicing through the surface in a loose semicircle, but the bull was nowhere to be seen. A shout from above snapped Jack's attention back to the helicopter. The rescue swimmer had jumped and was cutting through the water towards him with powerful strokes. Jack had never seen a more welcome sight in his life. "Hold on, sir," the swimmer called as he drew closer. "I'm coming to you." Jack wanted to cry with relief. Just a few more moments and he'd be safe. He'd survived the impossible. A prolonged orca attack, the sinking of his beloved boat, miles of open ocean. He was going to make it. That's when he saw it. A massive dark shape moving beneath the surface, heading straight for the rescue swimmer. The bull orca, wounded but far from beaten, had been biding its time, and now it was going for the new threat in its waters. "Look out!" Jack screamed, waving his arms frantically. "Behind you!" The rescue swimmer turned, but it was too late. The bull orca burst from the depths with explosive force, its enormous body launching clear of the water. Time seemed to slow as Jack watched in horror. He could see every detail, the scars on the orca's skin, the red line along its jaw where the boat hook had struck, the intelligence burning in its eye as it focused on its target. The orca crashed back into the water mere feet from the swimmer, the impact sending up a spray of water that momentarily obscured Jack's view. When it cleared, the swimmer was gone. "No!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking. This couldn't be happening, not when he was so close to rescue. The surface of the water churned as a desperate struggle played out beneath. Jack could see flashes of the swimmer's bright orange wetsuit, contrasting sharply with the orca's black and white body. Then, with a surge of displaced water, both disappeared into the depths. Jack treaded water, his heart pounding so hard, he thought it might burst from his chest. Seconds ticked by, feeling like an eternity. The helicopter hovered overhead, its crew undoubtedly witnessing the same horrifying scene. Just when Jack thought all hope was lost, the surface exploded, upward. The rescue swimmer burst into view, gasping for air. In one hand, he clutched a wicked-looking knife. Red clouded the water around him. "Swim!" the swimmer shouted, his voice rough with exertion and fear. "Swim to me now." Jack didn't need to be told twice. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he struck out for the swimmer. The orcas, momentarily stunned by the unexpected resistance, hung back, but Jack knew it wouldn't last. The scent of blood in the water would drive them into a frenzy. As Jack reached the swimmer, he could see the man was injured. A long gash ran down his arm, and his face was pale beneath his protective gear. "Are you okay?" Jack gasped as the swimmer grabbed him with his good arm. "I'll live," the man grunted, "which is more than I can say for us if we don't get out of here fast. Can you hold on to me?" Jack nodded, wrapping an arm around the swimmer's shoulders. With his free hand, the swimmer produced a small signaling device and pressed a button. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and Jack saw a thin cable begin to unspool from the device. "Hold on tight," the swimmer warned. "This is going to be rough." The cable went taut, and suddenly they were being pulled through the water at breathtaking speed. Jack clung to the swimmer with every ounce of strength he had left, his body screaming in protest at the sudden acceleration. Behind them, the orca pod had shaken off their momentary hesitation. Jack could hear their calls, filled with rage and frustration as their prey escaped. He risked a glance back and immediately wished he hadn't. The bull orca was in pursuit, its massive body torpedoing through the water with terrifying speed. "Faster," Jack shouted, though he knew it was useless. They were already being pulled as fast as the winch could manage. The bull orca was gaining on them, its open jaws just yards behind Jack's kicking feet. He could see the rows of sharp teeth, could almost feel the hot breath on his legs. This was it. After everything he'd been through, he was going to die within arm's reach of safety. Suddenly, the water around them exploded into chaos. The rescue helicopter had released a barrage of sea dye markers, small canisters that burst on impact, releasing a cloud of bright orange dye into the water. The sudden assault of color and noise disoriented the orcas, breaking their pursuit. With a final surge of speed, Jack and the rescue swimmer broke free of the water's grasp. They dangled beneath the helicopter, swinging wildly as they were winched upward. Jack's grip on the swimmer began to slip, his arms weak from exhaustion and cold. "I've got you," the swimmer grunted, tightening his hold. "Don't you dare let go now." As they were pulled into the helicopter's cabin, Jack caught one last glimpse of the ocean below. The orcapod had regrouped, their dorsal fins cutting through the orange-stained water as they circled restlessly. The bull orca breached, its massive body arcing through the air in what seemed like a final challenge. Then the cabin door slammed shut, and Jack Thornton found himself surrounded by the blessed noise and chaos of human activity. Hands reached for him. Voices shouted instructions he couldn't quite process. Someone wrapped a thermal blanket around his shoulders, its metallic surface crinkling as it trapped what little body heat he had left. "You're safe now," a paramedic assured him, shining a light in his eyes. "Can you tell me your name?" Jack opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading fast, leaving him shaky and disoriented. The events of the past hours, had it only been hours, played through his mind in a confused jumble of terror and pain. "Jack," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Jack Thornton." "Well, Mr. Thornton," the paramedic said with a smile, "you've just survived something I've never seen in all my years of rescue work. Those orcas really had it out for you." Jack nodded weakly, unable to find the words to describe the nightmare he'd just lived through. As the helicopter banked, heading for the nearest hospital, he found his gaze drawn to the small window. The inside passage stretched out below, a patchwork of islands and waterways that had once seemed so inviting. Now, Jack knew, it would forever be tainted by the memory of sleek black bodies and razor-sharp teeth. "Rest now," the paramedic urged, gently pushing Jack to lie back on the stretcher. "You're going to be okay." As exhaustion finally overtook him, Jack Thornton closed his eyes. He was alive against all odds, but as the darkness of unconsciousness claimed him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed out there in those cold waters. The line between predator and prey, between man and nature, had been blurred in ways he never thought possible. And somewhere in the depths of the inside passage, a pod of orcas continued their patrol, their haunting calls echoing through waters that would never quite be the same again. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Yao hospital room cast a sickly pallor over Jack Thornton's face as he stared blankly at the ceiling. The steady beep of the heart monitor and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway were a far cry from the haunting calls of orcas and the crash of waves that still echoed in his mind. It had been 3 days since his rescue, but Jack still felt as if he were drifting in those cold waters, caught between life and death. The doctors had treated him for hypothermia, exhaustion, and the various cuts and bruises he'd sustained during his ordeal. But the deepest wounds, Jack knew, weren't visible on any medical chart. A soft knock at the door roused Jack from his thoughts. He turned his head to see a tall, lean man in a crisp uniform standing in the doorway. The patch on his shoulder identified him as a member of the Canadian Coast Guard. "Mr. Thornton, I'm Lieutenant Commander James Harper. Do you feel up to answering a few questions?" Jack nodded wearily, using the bed's controls to sit up straighter. "Come in," he said, his voice still hoarse from swallowing seawater and shouting, "For help." Harper pulled up a chair and sat down, producing a small notebook and pen. "First off, Mr. Thornton, I want to assure you that you're not in any trouble. We're just trying to piece together exactly what happened out there. Your experience is, well, it's unprecedented to say the least." Jack let out a humorless chuckle. "You're telling me?" Harper leaned forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Can you walk me through the events leading up to the attack? Start from the beginning, please." Jack closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he forced himself to relive the nightmare. "I set out from Port Hardy 3 days ago. Solo sailing trip through the Inside Passage. Nothing I haven't done a dozen times before." He recounted the first day of his journey, the initial sighting of the ORCA pod, and the growing sense of unease that had plagued him that night. "And you're certain the orcas were exhibiting unusual behavior from the start?" Harper interjected, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Jack nodded emphatically. "I've seen orcas plenty of times in these waters. They've always been curious. Maybe, but never aggressive. This was different. It was like they were hunting me." As Jack described the relentless assault on his boat, the terror of abandoning ship, and the desperate swim for shore, Harper's pen flew across the page. The lieutenant commander's professional demeanor slipped occasionally, his eyes widening at particularly harrowing details. "And the bull orca, the one you injured with the boat hook?" Harper pressed. "You're sure it was the same one that attacked the rescue swimmer?" Jack's hands clenched involuntarily, bunching the thin hospital sheets. "Positive. I saw the mark on its jaw where I'd hit it. That orca. It wasn't just acting on instinct. It was angry. It wanted revenge." Harper sat back, tapping his pen against his notebook thoughtfully. "Mr. Thornton, I've been with the Coast Guard for 15 years. I've seen orcas breach near boats, even bump them playfully, but I've never heard of a coordinated attack like this. It's hard to believe." Jack felt a surge of anger cut through his exhaustion. "You think I'm making this up? That I scuttled my own boat and nearly drowned myself for what? Attention?" No, Harper said quickly, holding up a placating hand. "I believe you experienced something traumatic out there. It's just, well, it goes against everything we know about orca behavior. They're not typically aggressive towards humans and certainly not to boats." "I know what I saw," Jack said firmly, meeting Harper's gaze. "Those orcas weren't just curious or playful. They were hunting me, and they nearly succeeded." Harper nodded slowly, jotting down a few more notes. "We've got a team out there now, surveying the wreckage of your boat and looking for any signs of the pod. The marine biologists are having a field day with this, let me tell you." Jack leaned back, against his pillows, suddenly feeling very tired. "What happens now?" "Well, we'll complete our investigation, of course, compare your account with the physical evidence and the testimony from the rescue team. As for you," Harper's expression softened slightly, "get some rest, Mr. Thornton. You've been through hell. There will be people who want to talk to you, scientists, reporters, probably some government officials. But that can wait until you're stronger." As Harper stood to leave, Jack called out, "The rescue swimmer. Is he okay?" The lieutenant commander paused at the door. "He'll recover." That was some quick thinking on his part with the knife. Not many people can say they've gone toe-to-toe with a bull orca and lived to tell the tale. After Harper left, Jack found himself alone with his thoughts once more. The interview had dredged up memories he'd been trying to suppress. The bone-jarring impacts as the orcas rammed his boat. The icy grip of the water as he swam for his life. The terrifying intelligence in the bull orca's eyes as it charged. The rescue swimmer. A knock at the door interrupted his dark reverie. A nurse poked her head in, smiling sympathetically. "Mr. Thornton, there are some people here to see you. They say they're from the Vancouver Aquarium's Marine Mammal Research team." Should I send them in, or would you prefer to rest? Jack hesitated. Part of him wanted nothing more than to close his eyes and pretend none of this had happened. But a larger part, the part that had kept him fighting in those cold waters, knew he needed answers. Send them in, he said, steeling himself. A moment later, 2 women entered the room. The older of the 2, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. Mr. Thornton, I'm Dr. Eleanor Sykes, head of cetacean research at the Vancouver Aquarium. This is my colleague, Dr. Mei Chen. She gestured to the younger woman beside her, who nodded in greeting. We understand you've been through a terrible ordeal, Dr. Chen said, her voice soft and tinged with a slight accent. We hoped you might be willing to share your experience with us. It could be invaluable to our understanding of orca behavior. Jack let out a bitter laugh. Seems like everyone wants to hear my story, but no one seems to believe it. Dr. Sykes pulled up a chair, her expression serious. Mr. Thornton, we're not here to judge or disbelieve. We're scientists. Our job is to observe, gather data, and try to understand. What you experienced is unprecedented, yes, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Something in her tone made Jack relax slightly. Here, at last, were people who might actually listen without immediately dismissing his account as the ravings of a traumatized sailor. Over the next hour, Jack recounted his story once more, this time in even greater detail. The 2 scientists listened intently, occasionally interrupting with clarifying questions or to jot down notes. When Jack finished, Dr. Chen leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mr. Thornton, in your opinion, did the orca's behavior seem coordinated, as if they were communicating and strategizing? Jack nodded emphatically. Absolutely. It wasn't random attacks. They worked together, hurting me, cutting off escape routes. The bull. It was like a commander, directing the others. Dr. Sykes and Dr. Chen exchanged a significant look. That aligns with what we know about orca social structures and hunting behaviors, Dr. Sykes mused. But to see it applied to a human target, it's extraordinary and troubling, Dr. Chen added. If this pod has learned to see boats and humans as potential prey, it could have serious implications for maritime safety in the region. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. You mean this could happen again? To someone else? Dr. Sykes held up a calming hand. Let's not jump to conclusions. Your experience, while horrifying, is still an isolated incident. We need to gather more data, observe this pod if we can locate them. Which brings us to our next question, Dr. Chen interjected. Mr. Thornton, would you be willing to assist us in our research? Your first-hand experience could be invaluable in helping us understand and potentially prevent future incidents. Jack blinked in surprise. Assist how? You don't expect me to go back out there? Both scientists were quick to assure him that wasn't the case. They explained their plan to outfit research vessels with specialized equipment to track and observe the orca pod safely. Jack's role would be to review footage, provide insights based on his experience, and potentially help identify individual orcas if they managed to get clear images. As they talked, Jack felt a strange mix of emotions churning inside him. The thought of seeing those orcas again, even on video, made his heart race. But there was also a pull, a need to understand why this had happened to him. I'll do it, he said finally, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. On one condition. If you find them, if you figure out why they did this, I want to know. Everything. Dr. Sykes nodded solemnly. Of course, Mr. Thornton. You, more than anyone, deserve answers. As the scientists prepared to leave, promising to be in touch once Jack was released from the hospital, Dr. Chen paused at the door. Mr. Thornton, I hope you know what you did out there, surviving against all odds. It's remarkable. Your experience, as terrible as it was, could lead to breakthroughs in our understanding of orca behavior. You may well save lives. After they left, Jack found himself staring out the window at the distant shoreline. Somewhere out there, beneath the seemingly peaceful waters, the orca pod was still patrolling. The thought sent a shiver through him, but it was tempered now by a new sense of purpose. He had survived for a reason, Jack realized. And if his nightmare could prevent someone else from experiencing the same terror, then maybe, just maybe, it would all be worth it. The next few days passed in a blur of medical checks, police interviews, and visits from various officials. Jack's story had spread quickly, capturing the imagination of the public and the concern of maritime authorities. He fielded calls from reporters and declined offers for exclusive interviews, not ready to relive his ordeal for the entertainment of others. A week after his rescue, Jack stood at the window of his hospital room, finally cleared to leave. He stared out at the harbor, watching boats come and go with a mix of longing and apprehension. The sea had been his home, his passion, for so long. Now it felt like a betrayal. A knock at the door drew his attention. He turned to see Sarah, the nurse who had been caring for him throughout his stay, entering with a wheelchair. "Ready to go, Mr. Thornton?" she asked with a gentle smile. Jack nodded, gathering the few belongings he had. As Sarah helped him into the wheelchair, hospital policy, despite his protests that he could walk, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked older, more haggard than he remembered. The ordeal had left its mark, not just in the fading bruises and healing cuts, but in the haunted look that lingered in his eyes. As they made their way through the hospital corridors, Jack braced himself for what he knew awaited him outside. Sure enough, as the automatic doors slid open, he was greeted by a barrage of camera flashes and shouted questions. "Mr. Thornton, how does it feel to be the first known survivor of a coordinated ORCA attack? Jack, will you ever sail again after this experience? Do you think the orcas were acting out of revenge for past human actions?" Sarah expertly maneuvered the wheelchair through the crowd, shielding Jack as best she could. At the curb, a nondescript sedan waited, its engine running. As Jack transferred from the wheelchair to the car's back seat, he caught snippets of conversation from the gathered crowd. "Never heard of orcas behaving like this. Government cover-up, mark my words. For always said those beasts were dangerous." The car door closed, muffling the chaos outside. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The driver, a stoic-faced man who introduced himself as Agent Carlson from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, pulled away from the curb. As they drove through the streets of Vancouver, Jack found his mind drifting back to the scientist's visit. Dr. Sykes had promised to keep him informed of their research, but so far, he hadn't heard anything. Were they out there now, tracking the pod that had nearly killed him? Had they found any answers? "Where are we going?" Jack asked, suddenly realizing he had no idea what came next. Agent Carlson met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Safe house, Mr. Thornton. Just until things die down a bit. We've got some people who want to debrief you more thoroughly, away from the media circus." Jack nodded, too tired to argue. As the city gave way to suburbs and then to the lush forests of the British Columbia coast, he found himself scanning the shoreline, half expecting to see a black dorsal fin cutting through the waves. The safe house turned out to be a modest cabin tucked away in a secluded cove. As Jack stepped out of the car, the scent of salt air and pine filled his lungs. It was achingly familiar, a reminder of countless sailing trips and peaceful nights, anchored in sheltered bays. But now, that same scent carried an undercurrent of danger, of memories he'd rather forget. Inside, he found a small team of researchers and government officials waiting for him. Over the next several hours, Jack once again recounted his experience, this time with a level of detail that left him drained and shaking. Every question probed deeper, forcing him to relive moments he'd been trying to push away. "And you're certain the orcas were targeting you specifically?" one researcher pressed. "Not just curious about the boat?" Jack's patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. "For the last time, yes. They weren't curious. They weren't playing. They were hunting me. Do you have any idea what it's like to be prey? To know that something intelligent, something that can strategize, wants you dead?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, an older man Jack hadn't noticed before spoke up from the corner. "We believe you, Mr. Thornton. That's why we're here. What you experienced, it could change everything we thought we knew about orca behavior, and we need to understand why." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin, the team finally wrapped up their questioning. Jack was shown to a small bedroom told to make himself comfortable and left alone with his thoughts. He stood at the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. In the distance, he could just make out the shimmer of moonlight on water. It was beautiful, peaceful even. But Jack knew now what lurked beneath that calm surface. He knew the intelligence, the power, and the potential for violence that swam in those dark waters. As he turned away from the window, his eye caught a folder left on the bedside table. Opening it, he found a preliminary report on the investigation into his attack. Most of it was technical jargon and inconclusive findings, but one passage stood out. Initial sonar scans of the area where Mr. Thornton's vessel sank have revealed unusual patterns of ORCA communication. Frequency and complexity of vocalizations suggest a level of coordination not typically observed in hunting behaviors. Further study is urgently recommended. Jack closed the folder, his mind reeling. They were out there, still patrolling their territory. And they were communicating, planning. What were they saying? What were they planning? As he lay down on the unfamiliar bed, Jack Thornton knew sleep would be long in coming. The scientists were right. His experience had changed everything. But as he stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of waves lapping at the shore, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Somewhere out in the vast dark waters of the inside passage, a pod of orcas was rewriting the rules of the relationship between humans and the sea. And Jack, whether he liked it or not, was now at the center of a mystery that could reshape our understanding of one of the ocean's most intelligent and deadly predators. The morning sun crept through the gaps in the curtains, casting long shadows across Jack Thornton's face as he sat motionless in the overstuffed armchair of Dr. Amanda Reeves's office. The therapist's soothing voice seemed to come from a great distance, barely penetrating the fog of memory that clouded Jack's mind. "Jack, are you still with me?" He blinked, forcing himself back to the present. "Sorry, what were you saying?" Dr. Reeves leaned forward, her kind eyes filled with concern. "I asked if you've had any more nightmares since our last session." Jack let out a humorless chuckle. "Nightmares? Doc, I'm living a nightmare. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that water. I can feel them circling, waiting." It had been 6 weeks since the attack. 6 weeks since Jack had faced death in the cold waters of the inside passage. The physical wounds had mostly healed. The cuts and bruises faded, the hypothermia a distant memory. But the psychological scars ran deep, etched into his psyche like the tooth marks on the hull of his beloved Serenity. Dr. Reeves made a note on her pad. "It's normal to experience intrusive thoughts and memories after a traumatic event, Jack. Have you been practicing the grounding techniques we discussed?" Jack nodded absently, his gaze drifting to the window. From this vantage point high in a Vancouver office building, he could just make out a sliver of the harbor. Boats moved back and forth, people going about their lives as if the world hadn't fundamentally changed. As if there wasn't a pod of killer whales out there that had learned to hunt humans. "I try," he said finally. "But it's hard to feel grounded when the ground keeps shifting under your feet. Everything I thought I knew about the ocean, about orcas, it's all been turned upside down." Dr. Reeves set her notepad aside, giving Jack her full attention. "You mentioned in our last session that you've been assisting with the research team studying the orca pod. How has that been going?" Jack's expression darkened. "Slowly. They've managed to track the pod, but getting close enough for detailed observations is challenging. The orcas seem to know when they're being watched. They change their behavior, become more elusive. And how does that make you feel being involved in the research?" Jack was silent for a long moment, considering the question. "Conflicted," he said finally. "Part of me wants answers. I need to understand why this happened, what made these orcas different. But another part," he trailed off, his hands clenching, involuntarily on the arms of the chair. Dr. Reeves waited patiently, giving him space to collect his thoughts. "Another part of me is terrified," Jack admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we learn something we're not prepared for? What if these orcas are just the beginning of something bigger?" Dr. Reeves nodded sympathetically. "It's natural to feel afraid after what you've been through, Jack, but it's important to remember that you survived. You're here. You're safe." Jack stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Am I? Are any of us?" Doc, you didn't see what I saw out there. These weren't just animals acting on instinct, they were intelligent, coordinated. They hunted me. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watching the boats in the harbor with a mixture of longing and dread. I used to love the ocean. It was my home, my passion. Now I can't even look at it without wondering what's lurking beneath the surface. Dr. Reeves joined him at the window, keeping a respectful distance. Jack, recovery from trauma isn't linear. There will be good days and bad days. The important thing is to keep moving forward, to not let fear control your life. Jack turned. To face her, his expression haunted. How? How do I move forward when everything's changed? One step at a time, Dr. Reeves said gently. You've already taken the first step by being here, by talking about your experience. Now we need to work on rebuilding your sense of safety and control. As their session wound down, Dr. Reeves suggested a new exercise. I want you to visit your boat this week, Jack. You don't have to go on the water, just see serenity in the boatyard. Reconnect with the positive memories you have of sailing. Can you do that for me? Jack hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'll try. As he left the office, Jack's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Mei Chen, one of the marine biologists he'd been working with. New data from latest expedition. Significant findings. Can you come to the lab? Jack's heart raced as he read the message. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to walk away from the whole investigation and try to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But he knew he couldn't. He was too deeply invested now, too desperate for answers. With a resigned sigh, Jack headed for the Vancouver Aquarium's research facility. The lab was a hive of activity when Jack arrived. Researchers huddled around computer screens, analyzing data and comparing notes. The excitement in the air was palpable. Dr. Chen spotted him and waved him over. Jack, thank you for coming. We've made a breakthrough. She led him to a large monitor displaying a complex spectrogram. This is a visual representation of the ORCA vocalizations we recorded during our last expedition. Look at the complexity. The patterns. Jack stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the swirling lines and colors. What am I looking at exactly? Dr. Chen's eyes gleamed with excitement. Communication, Jack. Highly sophisticated communication. We've always known orcas are intelligent, that they use vocalizations to coordinate hunting and maintain social bonds. But this is different. She pointed to a series of repeating patterns in the spectrogram. See these sequences? They're too complex, too consistent to be random. We believe the pod may have developed a form of symbolic language. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying they can talk to each other? Actually communicate? Complex ideas? Dr. Chen nodded eagerly. It's a working theory, but the evidence is compelling. And there's more. She pulled up another file, this one showing a series of underwater photographs. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the distinctive markings of the bull orca that had led the attack on him. We've identified the individuals in the pod, Dr. Chen explained. The bull, we're calling him Scar due to the marking on his jaw where you struck him with the boat hook. He appears to be the leader, the one coordinating their activities. Jack stared at the image of Scar, feeling a mix of fear and something else, a grudging respect for the creature's intelligence and determination. There's something else you need to see, Dr. Chen said, her tone growing serious. She pulled up a video file. This is footage from a fishing trawler's security camera, taken 2 days ago about 50 miles north of where you were attacked. The grainy video showed a calm sea, the trawler's wake stretching behind it. Suddenly, a large dorsal fin broke the surface, then another and another. Jack counted at least 6 orcas, circling the boat with obvious intent. My God, he breathed. They're hunting it. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. The attack lasted nearly an hour. The orcas worked in concert, ramming the hull, trying to capsize the boat. The crew managed to radio for help and were eventually rescued by the Coast Guard. But the video showed the trawler listing heavily to one side, water pouring in through multiple breaches in the hull. As Jack watched in horror, the boat slowly slipped beneath the waves. This can't be happening, Jack muttered, running a hand through his hair. It's not just me, not just a freak occurrence. They're actively hunting boats now. Dr. Chen put a comforting hand on his shoulder. This is why your insights are so valuable, Jack. You're the only person who's experienced their hunting behavior firsthand and survived to tell about it. We need your help to understand what's happening, to find a way to prevent more attacks. Jack turned away from the screen, his mind reeling. What do you need me to do? We're planning another expedition, Dr. Chen explained. We want to get closer to the pod, to observe their behavior in more detail, and we want you to come with us. Jack's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. You want me to go back out there? Are you insane? Dr. Chen held up a placating hand. I know it's a lot to ask, Jack, but we'll be on a large research vessel, fully equipped with the latest ORCA deterrent technology. You'll be completely safe. Jack let out a bitter laugh. Safe? Doc, I was on a boat I'd sailed for years, in waters I knew like the back of my hand, and they still nearly killed me. There's no such thing as safe with these orcas. I understand your fear, Jack, but think of what we could learn. Your experience combined with our scientific observations, we could make breakthroughs that could save lives. Jack paced the lab, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The thought of going back out on the water, of coming face to face with Scar and his pod again, filled him with paralyzing dread. But there was something else, too. A burning need to understand, to confront the creatures that had turned his life upside down. I need time to think about it, he said finally. Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. Of course. The expedition isn't scheduled for another 2 weeks. Take some time, talk it over with Dr. Reeves if you need to. But Jack, we really do need you on this. As Jack left the lab, his head spinning with everything he'd learned, he found himself drawn to the aquarium's ORCA exhibit. He stood at the underwater viewing window, watching the graceful movements of the captive orcas. They were beautiful, he had to admit. Powerful, intelligent, perfectly adapted to their environment. But as he watched, he couldn't shake the memory of those same sleek bodies torpedoing through the water towards him, jaws open wide, intent on his destruction. A small boy pressed his face against the glass next to Jack, his eyes wide with wonder. Wow, the child breathed. They're so cool. Jack looked down at the boy, then back at the orcas. In that moment, he made his decision. He couldn't let fear rule his life. He couldn't stand by and watch as others faced the same terror he had experienced. He had to go back out there, had to face his demons. For the sake of that little boy, for all the people who still saw the ocean as a place of wonder rather than terror, Jack knew what he had to do. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Jack threw himself into studying the latest ORCA research, reviewing the data from previous expeditions, and working with the team to develop observation protocols. Dr. Reeves had been skeptical when Jack told her about the expedition. Are you sure you're ready for this, Jack? Facing your trauma head-on can be therapeutic, but it can also be incredibly triggering. Jack nodded, his jaw set with determination. I have to do this, Doc. I can't move forward until I face them again, until I understand why this happened. The night before the expedition was set to depart, Jack found himself standing on the dock, staring at the hulking form of the research vessel that would be their home for the next week. The Oceanic Explorer was an impressive ship, bristling with advanced scientific equipment and safety features. But to Jack, it looked terrifyingly vulnerable. Having second thoughts, Jack turned to see Dr. Eleanor Sykes, the head of the ICAIM research team, approaching. The older woman's face was lined with concern. About 1 million of them, Jack admitted. But I'm still going. Dr. Sykes nodded approvingly. That's courage, Jack. Not fearlessness, but doing what needs to be done, despite the fear. As they boarded the ship and prepared for departure, Jack felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. The last time he'd set out on these waters, he'd been full of excitement and anticipation. Now he couldn't shake the feeling that he was sailing into the jaws of death. The first few days of the expedition were uneventful. They tracked the orca pod from a distance, observing their movements and recording their vocalizations. Jack found himself falling into the rhythm of life at sea, his old instincts resurfacing despite his lingering fear. It was on the 4th day that everything changed. Jack was on deck helping to deploy a new hydrophone array when he saw it. A tall black dorsal fin cutting through the water, heading straight for the ship. "Contact!" he shouted, his voice cracking with sudden terror. "Port side, coming in fast." The research team scrambled to their observation posts as more fins appeared. Jack counted 6, 7, 8 orcas, moving with the coordinated precision he remembered all too well. Dr. Chen appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. "It's them. It's Scar's pod." Jack nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the approaching orcas. He could see the distinctive scar on the bull's jaw, a reminder of their last encounter. "What's the plan?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain steady. Dr. Sykes joined them, her expression grave. "We stay calm, we observe, and we be ready to deploy the deterrence if necessary. This is what we came for, people. Let's make it count." The next hour was the most intense of Jack's life. The orcas circled the ship, their movements eerily reminiscent of the attack on his sailboat. But this time, Jack was an observer rather than a victim. He watched in awe and terror as the pod coordinated their movements, testing the ship's defenses. "Look at that," Dr. Chen breathed, pointing to where 2 of the orcas were positioned at the ship's bow. "They're using the wake to reduce their energy expenditure. That's a hunting technique typically used for large prey like whales." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "They're treating the ship like prey, just like they did with Serenity." As if on cue, Scar suddenly broke from the formation, charging straight for the ship's hull. At the last moment he dove, his massive body barely skimming the surface. "Brace for impact!" Jack yelled, his body tensing in anticipation of the collision. But the impact never came. Instead, Scar resurfaced on the other side of the ship, joining the rest of the pod in their circling pattern. Dr. Sykes frowned, studying the orca's behavior intently. "They're not attacking. This is something else, some kind of assessment." For hours, the dance continued. The orcas would approach, sometimes coming close enough that Jack could see their eyes watching the humans on deck. But they never made contact with the ship, never fully committed to an attack. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the water, the pod suddenly broke formation. With a series of spectacular breaches, they turned and swam away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The deck of the Oceanic Explorer erupted in a flurry of excited chatter as the researchers compared notes and analyzed data. But Jack stood silent at the railing, his eyes fixed on the spot where the orcas had vanished. Dr. Chen approached him, her face flushed with excitement. "Jack, this is incredible. The data we've gathered today on it's going to revolutionize our understanding of orca behavior." Jack nodded absently, his mind still processing what he'd witnessed. "They were studying us," he said quietly. "Just like we were studying them." Dr. Chen's excitement dimmed slightly as she considered his words. "You really think so?" "I know so," Jack said, turning to face her. "I saw it in their eyes. The same intelligence, the same curiosity that I saw when they attacked me. They're learning, adapting, and I'm not sure that's a good thing for us." As the expedition continued, Jack found himself torn between fascination and fear. The orca pod returned several times, each encounter providing new insights into their behavior and capabilities. But with each visit, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being assessed, measured up as potential prey. On the final day of the expedition, as they were preparing to return to port, Scar made one last appearance. The massive orca surfaced right next to the ship, close enough that Jack could have reached out and touched him. For a long moment, man and whale locked eyes. Jack saw intelligence there, a depth of understanding that both awed and terrified him. Then, with a flick of his massive tail, Scar dove and disappeared. As the Oceanic Explorer made its way back to Vancouver, Jack stood at the stern, watching the coastline of British Columbia slip by. He felt changed by the experience, his fear tempered by a new understanding and respect for these incredible creatures. Dr. Sykes joined him, her weathered face etched with a mix of excitement and concern. "Penny for your thoughts, Jack?" He took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air. "I'm not sure I can put it into words, Doc. A week ago I was terrified of going back on the water. Now, I'm still afraid, but it's different." "How so?" she prodded gently. Jack turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the complexity of his emotions. I've seen what these orcas are capable of. Their intelligence, their coordination, it's beyond anything we imagined. But I've also seen their curiosity, their restraint. They could have attacked us at any time, but they didn't. Dr. Sykes nodded thoughtfully. So what do you think it means? I think, Jack said slowly, choosing his words carefully, that we're at a crossroads. These orcas, Scar's pod, they're changing, evolving maybe, and how we respond to that. Change could determine the future of our relationship with them. You sound almost optimistic, Dr. Sykes observed with a raised eyebrow. Jack let out a short laugh. Maybe I am. Don't get me wrong, I still have nightmares about what happened to me, but being out here, seeing them again, it's helped me understand that they're not monsters. They're highly intelligent animals adapting to a changing world just like us. As the Vancouver skyline came into view, Jack felt a sense of purpose settling over him. He knew that the work they had done on this expedition was just the beginning. There were still so many questions to answer, so much to learn about these fascinating and potentially dangerous creatures. What happens now? He asked Dr. Sykes. The older scientist smiled. Now we analyze our data, write our reports, and prepare for the next expedition. This is groundbreaking research, Jack. It's going to take years to fully understand what we've observed. Jack nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. I want to be part of it, he said firmly. All of it. Whatever comes next, I need to see this through. Dr. Sykes placed a hand on his shoulder. We'd be honored to have you continue with us, Jack. Your insights, your experience, they're invaluable. As the oceanic explorer docked, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fear that had gripped him since the attack hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something else. A driving curiosity, a need to understand. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more encounters with Scar and his pod. The threat they posed to maritime safety was real and would need to be addressed. But Jack was no longer running from his trauma. He was facing it head-on, determined to find a way for humans and orcas to coexist in this changing world. As he stepped off the ship, Jack took one last look at the vast expanse of the Pacific. Somewhere out there, Scar and his pod were swimming, hunting, living their lives, and Jack Thornton, once their prey, now found himself in the unique position of being their interpreter to the human world. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. But as he walked down the dock, ready to face whatever came next, Jack realized that for the first time since the attack, he felt truly alive. The scars of his ordeal would always remain, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had become a bridge between two worlds, a reminder of the incredible complexity of life in the ocean and the endless capacity for adaptation and understanding. Jack joined the research team as they unloaded their equipment, his mind already racing with ideas for their next expedition. The mystery of Scar's pod was far from solved, but Jack was ready for the challenge. Whatever the future held, he would face it with open eyes and a determined heart, forever changed by his encounter with the orcas, but no longer controlled by fear. As the sun set over Vancouver Harbor, casting a golden glow across the water, Jack allowed himself a small smile. The ocean, once his greatest love and then his deepest fear, had become something new to him. A vast, complex world of wonder and challenge, filled with creatures as intelligent and adaptable as any on land. And Jack Thornton, survivor and researcher, was ready to dive back in, this time armed not just with scientific equipment, but with a newfound respect for the incredible beings that called the ocean home. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but Jack was no longer alone. He had a team behind him, a purpose before him, and a determination to understand and protect the delicate balance between humans and the magnificent, mysterious orcas of the Pacific Northwest.